There's just so much, I think, stuff, again, that boils up when we talk in that much depth about our lives. And I mean, we both started crying on the recording.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
So we've got on friend of the show, Maximilian Alvarez, right, Adam?
We sure do.
Max, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come on the Valley Labor Report. I appreciate it.
Oh man, it is always an honor to be on Alabama's only weekly labor union show. And love seeing you guys. Love the work that you do. Everyone listening, please support this show. We need it now more than ever.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Listeners will recognize his voice from our intro. That was really cool to have him do that. I was really happy about that. So, Max, we'll just go ahead and jump into it. Your book is a really, really similar concept to your podcast, Working People. And so, let's talk about that first. What inspired you to do your podcast?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on to talk about the book. I'm still kind of blown away that it's out in the world. It felt like it would never happen, but then again, COVID kind of turned time into a flat circle, so maybe it wasn't actually that long of a wait. But yeah, I mean, the SparkNotes version, which I've told on my show Working People before, is you can see it just by looking at the catalog, right? The first interview I ever did for the show, which I've now interviewed close to 300 workers, over the years, not counting all the bonus episodes and all that stuff. But the first episode was with my dad, Jesus Alvarez, because our family had lost everything in the Great Recession, including eventually the house that I grew up in. And like so many millions of others, we were just sort of left to flounder while the government threw, all of its weight behind the banks and corporations, leaving working people to fall into the abyss. And so it was many years after the initial crash in 2008 that we lost the house in 2012, so 10 years ago. And my folks weren't talking about it. I wasn't really talking about it. Like, we were just sort of sitting there boiling in our own sense of failure, and, not reaching out for help, not processing the trauma that we had been through. And it was really hurting our family. And I noticed something because at this time I was working as a warehouse temp in Southern California. And my dad was driving for Uber and Lyft. All of this was going towards trying to keep the house that, again, we eventually did lose. And I noticed that my dad, who is not usually a very, talkative person, he started kind of opening up more to the folks that he was driving in Uber and Lyft because he was trying to keep his ratings up, right? He can be very good and affable in those sorts of situations, but it was in that situation that he started to realize, as he was talking to folks, that he was driving people who were his age, who were working 2 or 3 jobs, who were also immigrants, who had also lost their house. My dad worked in real estate before that, so it was more of a individual type of work. There was no real collective sense of worker solidarity. There wasn't a lot of chat, around the water coolers, all that kind of stuff. So this was one of the first times that my dad began to talk to other workers outside of his own industry and began to realize how widespread the problem was and how he shouldn't be ashamed, right, of being a casualty of a worldwide recession. And that really clued me into just how much stuff there is sitting inside the brains and hearts of working people that never gets a chance to come out, that we never share because we're rarely ever given the opportunity to talk in depth about our lives, jobs, dreams, and struggles. But if we do open up to one another, if we do show our scars and share our stories, you really can build incredible solidarity, these bonds of love and trust and support that, I wanted to make space for. And so that's why the first episode I ever did was with my dad, to try to get him to talk about this stuff. And he opened up more than he ever had. And so then I knew there was something there. And so I kept talking to different types of workers, and I kept being blown away by how much they would open up, how much they wanted to share if they would only be given the chance to, and how much people responded to that. And so that's where the podcast started 5 seasons ago.
And that, that's kind of how you open the show, open every episode. Working People is a podcast about the lives, struggles, dreams, and aspirations of the working class. And that's really, it really, really runs the gamut. You just sit down and you have a conversation with people about everything. How did you grow up? Tell me about your parents. Tell me about your friends, your going to school, your first job. There are some episodes that you do that have like a point beyond just sharing stories. You'll elevate people's you'll elevate the struggles that they're having at work, campaigns to make their working conditions better and stuff like that. But there are several episodes, most of them are just learning about this person's life. And there's nothing beyond that other than, as a political statement, it's good to learn about other normal working people. And that's something that we just don't see that kind of stuff. We see these profiles about, how did the CEO of this Fortune 500 company, how did they make their millions? And we learn all about, the relationship problems that Elvis Presley had. And there are movies that are made about it, blockbuster movies. But just a regular people never get that kind of treatment. And I think that's what your book and your podcast does every week, is it gives them, you're not able to give them like a feature film, but you are able to give them a platform and to just allow them to talk about their life and contextualize it in the way that they want. And I think that's that's a really, really cool thing that very few people are doing and have ever done.
Well, thank you, brother. I really appreciate that. This is like what, as you said, I tried to carry over into the book, right? Because even when in 2020, around the late spring, early summer, when we were all terrified, when no one knew what was going on, people were dying en masse. It was a very, very scary time. And after decades of hollowing out basically every social safety net, of entrusting the market to solve all of our problems, we here in the U.S. and folks around the world were really caught in a terrible position, because the supports that we needed to respond to something like COVID-19, which experts had been saying was going to be coming at some point or another, we didn't listen to that. And so, working people were really, screwed in that moment. But it was also working people who banded together, who took care of each other, who sacrificed immeasurably to keep the world from falling apart. And that's what I wanted to honor in this book. But to your point, Jacob, like this has been part of what I want to do from the very beginning. I recorded that first episode with my dad, to every interview that I record for the podcast, the interviews that I do at the Real News Network when I talk to workers, I try to incorporate this as well. And especially in this book that just came out, The Work of Living. I don't, as I told our brother and comrade in arms up in Canada, Lucas Costello, I once told him on his show, we're more than just name tags, right? There is a heart and human being behind every name tag, behind every job title. All the services that we depend on are made possible by flesh and blood human beings with lives and backstories and wants and desires and dreams and pain and heartbreak. There's just so much to us. And this capitalist system trains us from birth to not see that, right? Or to not consider it valuable, to consider it somehow, extraneous to everything else. And I think that you see on a societal level how much inhumanity we can come to accept when we train ourselves to not recognize or value the humanity of our fellow workers. And if we only see them as kind of human shaped cardboard cutouts performing services or providing goods for us as consumers. If we start to buy into that fiction, if our vision starts to, become what the system wants it to be, we will miss and accept all of the injustices that working people endure every single day. And I saw that in the late spring and early summer of 2020, where people were talking about, the heroism of frontline workers and the quote unquote essential nature of their work while people were dying en masse. And there was something of a discord for me, because it felt like we were honoring workers in general while simultaneously not caring about the lives of the actual working people who were dying from all of this. And I wanted to correct that. I wanted to give the working people who were living through this, working through this, fighting through this, a chance to share their stories, and for people to read it and not just see a bartender or a gig worker, but to see a whole human being with a deep backstory. You're never going to be able to get the whole complexity of every person's life in a single interview, but I hope that I've at least given people a sense of how much depth there is to all of us and how important and valuable and sacred that is.
Right. What made you feel like this project, there needed to be a book in it? I mean, you do the podcast every week, and so what was it about the pandemic that you felt like, this needs a book, like not just a podcast episode or a series of episodes? There needs to be a book about this.
It's a great question, and I know we're running up on time, so I'll try to speed through it. But I mean, like, I did originally start with the podcast, right? That's what I had. So I put out a call in like May of 2020 to workers to send in testimonies describing what they were going through at that time. And I got an overwhelming response. And if folks want to listen to it, you can go back in the catalog and you'll see that I published a 2-part compilation of these testimonies, almost 6 hours worth of working people describing what they were going through at that moment. And so thankfully, Teddy Ostro, the great Teddy Ostro, editor at Or Books, reached out to me and asked if I would want to do a book about that. And I wasn't quite sure, because I'm very partial to the medium of audio for these kinds of interviews. I think it's the most intimate way for people to have that kind of conversation, to open up in that way. And it's where I feel the most comfortable. But I did see, as time wore on, I saw the importance of recording these interviews and preserving these voices and experiences and impressions at the end of the first year of COVID-19, because I was seeing how quickly we as a society were being trained to accept the unacceptable, right? We were accepting the very things that had horrified us months, if not, weeks before, whether that be the lack of PPE provided to frontline workers getting quote unquote hero pay because companies didn't want to call it hazard pay, because if they did, they would have to pay it as long as the hazard of COVID-19 persisted. Companies like Amazon just ripping that hero pay away, even though the pandemic kept going, vaccines weren't out yet. It was just truly horrifying to see the ways that working people were taken for granted, even while they kept society afloat. And I knew that portended more sort of misinformation, more misremembering by the ruling class as things wore on. And so I wanted to make sure that at least in this book, we had on the historical record the voices of 10 working people describing what they had gone through, how they were feeling about it, how they were experiencing COVID-19. And, I think that it's very instructive to go back and listen to their stories. And I hope that people who read it now and in the future recognize the supreme injustice that has been done, and also recognize the incalculable loss of all the millions of friends and family members and coworkers and fellow parishioners whom we have lost over the past 2.5 years. And I hope that this book and these stories and these brave workers who I'm honored to have in this book, and I cannot thank enough for sharing their stories with me, and I can't thank enough everyone who helped me connect with these workers. I hope that when we read these stories and lift them up and honor them, that it leads us to fight harder for one another, and to make sure that working people are never taken advantage of or forgotten or exploited the way that they have been up until now.
You said that you put out a call for workers to tell their stories, and is that basically just how you found the subjects of the book?
So the book I put, more detective work into, right? I mean, it was tough because with the podcast, right, as you guys know, right, podcasts are much more forgiving with this kind of thing. Because ever since the first season of Working People, I've been extremely mindful about how the catalog itself represents or it offers our kind of representation of who and what the working class is. And I don't take that lightly. And so that's why it's been, you got to constantly be mindful of the types of workers that you're having on, the voices that you engage, the issues and struggles that you talk about, so that you're giving an accurate depiction of what's going on around the country. And essentially, I've tried to include as many different types of workers, and I haven't wanted to define for people what is the working class, who counts as the working class. I've wanted to let that kind of develop out of the stories of actual workers over the course of 5 seasons, so that people can see the different types of work that people do, the different kinds of lives that people live, but also, the things that really bind us together, the common experiences that we have working in this rigged economy, so on and so forth. But the point I'm getting to is that there every time I think about that in regards to the podcast, I'm always like, oh, I need to talk to this person, I need to talk to more people in this area. And with a podcast, you can do that. You can always keep adding episodes, and then taken as a whole, you feel like you've done a better job accurately kind of reporting on and covering the voices of workers in different industries. A book is much, much different. You are obviously bound by the
Right.
page count. And so it was actually incredibly anxiety producing for me to have to limit, this book of interviews to 10 interviews. And in fact, some interviews that I originally recorded were cut because it would just, the publisher thought it would be too long. And, people, there are all these calculations that, like, if a book goes over this amount, the numbers of people buying it drops precipitously. So I understand that that's kind of the calculation that has to be made on the publisher side. But obviously, when I first talked about the book to the publisher, I was like, I want to interview like 50 people. I want this book to be like the size of War and Peace. That wasn't going to happen. So I had to be much more careful and mindful of the folks that I talked to. And there's still so many people that I didn't get to talk to, and I feel like I have to constantly apologize because I look at this book and the main thing I see is all the voices that are not there. But as I say in the preface, I really want to emphasize to people that this is not meant to be some sort of holistically, demographically representative compendium of worker voices. No book could really do that. And also, it's not the way that I want people thinking about workers. I don't want people thinking about these individual human beings with their incredible stories as sort of like metaphors for much bigger groups of workers, right? Again, I don't want us to be thinking about each other in that way. I want us to see each other as individuals who have a lot in common, especially through work and the ways that we work and how we work in this system. So that's a long preamble to answer your question. I knew that a lot of focus in the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic had been on frontline workers, particularly workers in healthcare and, kind of essential services like that. And so I wanted to sort of balance in the book, like having folks in the, government recognized essential category, as well as workers who were not being talked about in that vein, workers who were essential. All workers are essential, of course, but I wanted to make sure that there was space in the book for workers who were doing essential work that wasn't being necessarily recognized as such. and I wanted that to kind of come through in the stories that they told. And so, in looking through, so many, I relied heavily on the great reporting that other folks had been doing in the early days of the pandemic, like Lauren Caroly Gurley, who connected me to Nick Gallupo, the grave digger, who is chapter 1. Nick is an incredible human being, and we talked about his life and work as a grave digger in New Jersey and what it was like doing that work as COVID hit. Like, thanks to Comrade Lauren, I was able to connect with Nick. And there were other folks who had reached out to me and said, hey, I heard you're doing a book. You should talk to my friend who's a bartender in Portland. So it was kind of a mishmash of things, but I did have initially a very long list of people I wanted to talk to. And I did, have to kind of gradually whittle that down so that the book could be digestible for people. But that's, I think, kind of the thought process that went behind it. And it took, I guess the last thing I would say is that it does take a lot of time and trust building, right? Because I'm asking working people, many of whom I've never met, to offer so much of themselves in this book. And it's a small publisher, or Books is a small publisher, so I basically use like the little advance that I got for the book to pay the interviewees. It's not going to make anything, in terms of royalties, but if I get a significant amount of royalties, I'm going to split it up and send it to everyone who's in the book, because it's more theirs than it is mine. But yeah, I mean, I think that asking folks to talk in so much depth and so personally about their lives, backstories, and experiences working through COVID-19, requires a lot of work on the front end to explain the project, to find time that works in people's busy schedules, and to also like really make sure that people have a sense of ownership over the interview, so that it's not like I'm extracting their stories and running away with them and sharing them to a wider audience. I wanted every interview to feel like a collaborative storytelling process that the people in this book could feel proud of and feel like it accurately represented what they were going through.
Is there anything about those interviews that surprised you? I know that you've been doing this for several years now, and so I'm wondering if there are if there are still things in doing your podcast that surprise you, but particular to the book, The Work of Living, is there anything that kind of stuck out to you that you weren't expecting?
I mean, I think, yeah, that's honestly one of the true gifts of doing this work, is that I'm always surprised. You never know, what sort of details in people's life stories there are, and like how those details are going to hit you, how they're going to come up in conversation. I think that's one of the things that I try to do and have tried to do since the very beginning of my show, Working People, is I don't ever want these interviews to feel like, I'm sitting there with my list of questions that I'm kind of firing at an interview subject, right? I always want every interview to feel like a genuine conversation. And I try to go where, my partner in conversation leads, because it's really their story that we're focusing on. Obviously, there are plenty of times where, folks are maybe who haven't done this kind of interview are a little nervous. Maybe we've talked off recording about something that I know that they want to talk to, but in the middle of the recording, they may forget about that. So I'll try to steer things in that way, because I know that's something that they want to address. So it's a very delicate balance, but I think that every time that I talk to a new worker on the show, on The Real News, or even for this book, I guess I'm always self-conscious about it, because I worry that people who know me and my story will get tired of me bringing up the same points from my life in conversation with others. But like, the folks that I'm talking to, they don't know about me. They don't know these details. So like, even though I'm using the same material from my life story because it's what I know best, but I use it to try to understand what they're going through, what they're telling me. It almost always leads in different directions that I never could have anticipated. I mean, one example is, I spoke with Courtney Smith, who is now actually been hired as an organizer at Labor Notes, which is really, really cool because Courtney's an incredible person, an incredible organizer. And she's really lived such a tough life and fought so hard to make the life for herself and her child that she has now. But we started talking just about growing up, right? She grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Southern California. Circumstances couldn't have been more different. But out of just sort of chatting about that for about an hour, we ended up, sort of learning things about ourselves and our own backstories and our families that, I don't think we'd ever put together before. And then Courtney, starts talking about like real kind of tragic circumstances, like the loss of her brother to suicide, like the incredibly dire straits that her mother endured trying to raise children as their father was in and out of prison. Like there's just so much, I think, stuff again that boils up when we give each other the opportunity to talk in that much depth about our lives. And I mean, we basically like both started crying on the recording because I don't think we anticipated it going there. But I guess the thing I would emphasize is that it's not me. It's any of us, will be equally surprised if we actually just turn to the people around us, the people we work with, the people in our own families, and just actually give each other that gift of deep attention and listening without an agenda. I think that you will find that your fellow workers will always surprise you, and it will always surprise you again just how the depth of their human stories, right? The vastness of the emotions that one person can feel on their one turn around this life, is truly incredible and humbling. Every time I talk to another person, I'm struck by that.
Yeah, I didn't make that connection. Courtney is actually the point person at Labor Notes for for the Alabama Troublemaker School that we're putting together. I'm on the organizing committee for it, and so I talked to her a little bit last week during our regular meeting planning for it. So that's pretty cool. I didn't realize it was that Courtney Smith. But you mentioned the you feel self-conscious always bringing up your stories because the people that are listening to your podcast have heard them, theoretically already. And this is something that, every now and then something that I will return to is things that I've taken out of the faith tradition that I grew up in, and even though I'm not a part of it. And something that they always did that was a big part of the church services, it was testimonies. And testimonies were even emphasized more than sermons at the church that I grew up at. Part of that is just the character of that particular church, but also part of it was the preacher was constantly ill. And so the preacher was often not even at church. They did church without a preacher. They had like people who would start the service, but I probably almost 50% of the services that I went to like didn't have a preacher at it, right? And so what did they fill the services with? They filled it with testimonies. And so like you have kind of your go-to stories about your life, people at these churches would have at the church that I grew up at, they had signature testimonies that they always felt self-conscious about telling, but nobody else feels that way about it. Everybody loves hearing those stories, and as new people come up in the church, you've got a whole new generation of. My sister was just talking to me last night, we were having a conversation with the family, and she was talking about how she was at church and there was a couple of older folks that were telling stories that they said, everybody's heard this. And she was like, I've never heard that one before. I wanted to hear that one, right? And so, in the same way that the church is going to have more people coming up, you're going to have more people listening to your podcast that are going to be hearing the story for the first time. And people that are regular listeners also just like hearing those things again and like hearing it tie into something different. So I would encourage you not to feel self-conscious about that, because I think that I enjoy it. I enjoyed it growing up as a part of that church, and I think that it's something that we definitely shouldn't feel self-conscious about. Telling stories that are important to us and that we can connect to the current, what we're talking about. I think that that's a neat little human thing that we have.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. I mean, we're human, right? I mean, it's natural, I guess, to feel that way. And I think on a good day, I take what you just said to heart. And I guess there's also, right, the added self-consciousness of not wanting to misrepresent myself and my position, right? Because I think that that's really important, for anyone doing this work, to be honest about who they are and what they're doing. And so, like, I always want to stress for people, when I talk about what our family went through, right, when we lost everything in the recession, when I talk about working, hard, shitty jobs like working 12 hours a day as a warehouse temp in Southern California, or working as a waiter in Chicago, or a pizza delivery guy in Anaheim, right? Like everyone else, I've had, these kinds of jobs, and there were times when they really sucked. There were times when they were fine. And there were even beautiful moments of camaraderie and solidarity that I experienced at these different jobs. But as time wears on, I become increasingly uncomfortable talking about these experiences, because I don't want to give people the impression that I'm like some, grifting Mike Rowe type of asshole being like, oh yeah, I know what it's like to work as the common man in these days. I mean, I'm here now. I work at the Real News Network. I'm in media, right? I get to work at a desk. I get to produce, media. That is my job. I'm not at the warehouse anymore. I'm not delivering pizzas. I'm not, doing those jobs. And I don't want to give people the sense that that is why I bring them up when I talk to people. I do it because, again, that's what I know. That's what I remember. This is the way that when people are telling me what they're going through, I can kind of reach back into the recesses of my experience, offer that to the conversation to try to better understand what they're telling me, and to try to kind of build some sort of connections between us that we can talk more about. And so I don't, maybe like if I'm going to keep doing this for the rest of my life, which I really hope I get to, eventually I'll have to kind of come up with some new things to talk about, but I think that that's also why it's important, right, to, as a host, right, doing what we do in our media realms at the Valley Labor Report, at Working People, and so on and so forth. I think one of the essential jobs that we have is connecting people, right? And so I think, like, one of the other things I always try to do is connect what people are telling me to other conversations that I've had with workers, because then folks who maybe never talk to each other in real life can learn more about how, wow, like, yeah, actually railroad workers have a lot in common with teachers, right? Or striking strippers in North Hollywood actually have a lot in common with other workers around the country. So it's our job to sort of bring those connections to light. But anyway, I won't keep talking about that.
Well, and I think Adam had a couple questions, but the last question that I had was a sort of working people interviewer type question. I'm interested in what it's like for you to be in this position where you talk to so many folks, and as you are, as you say, talking about their life struggles and hopes and dreams. I mean, there's a lot of breadth in there. A lot of, there's highs and lows in these conversations, and you're reliving some of the stuff that you went through. And so, what is it like to do the work that the work that you do in putting together this book and doing the podcast and in trying to lift up working people's stories through the Real News Network and other outlets that you write for? What is it? What is it like for you as doing this as your profession?
So, I don't think I've ever been asked that question. And I appreciate you asking it. Because I do think there's a lot that people don't see. And I don't really generally feel comfortable talking about it because I'm like, the whole point of the show, right, is that this is not about me, this is about the workers, right? And every time people bring me on this show and other great shows, like not included in this, but like when bigger news shows want to ask me on to talk about like what's going on with workers, I try to always say, don't listen to me, listen to the workers themselves, right? I will try to convey to you what they have told me, but I've got archives of them telling their stories in more depth. You should go listen to that, right? So it's always like kind of awkward to talk about like what I'm going through doing this work, but again, I appreciate the question, because I think it's an incredible gift that I've been given. It's an incredible opportunity that I have to do this work. I'm incredibly grateful that I actually get to do it for a living. Because that's really not the case. And there are so many great journalists out there who are also doing this work to lift up the voices and struggles of working people who are hustling their asses off, who have built trust with workers around the country, and who are living a hand-to-mouth freelancer existence, who like we need to support as much as we possibly can. There's so many great people doing this work that don't get that recognition and don't get to do it in a sustained way because it's not the kind of work that the media industry supports. So we need to be the ones to collectively help support it. Now, getting to the actual answer, then I'll shut up. One of the things that I'm just so grateful for, right, and this really became apparent during COVID-19, I honestly think it kept me sane, right? It kept me sane because even though I was locked in inside, and I was fortunate enough to not have a job that I had to venture out to do, when COVID-19 hit. Not everyone had that luxury. A lot of people died, sacrificing to make a paycheck. I was able to stay connected to people by having these conversations on my podcast, on The Real News, and for this book. And it made me feel, it always makes me feel more connected to people. It makes me feel more grounded. As a media personality, I think it really holds me to account. Every time I'm giving an interview, I'm thinking of the working people who have shared their stories with me, and I'm like, if I misrepresent what they're saying, they're going to give me shit for it, as they rightly should. So I need to be on my game, and I need to be a responsible steward of their stories. But anyway, like just being able to talk to a railroad dispatcher named Jay about growing up in rural Pennsylvania, and how much the beautiful memories he has about his grandma, and how he's worked on the railroads for 20 years and has seen the industry go to shit. That's a real gift, because if you think about it, outside of our friend groups, like we don't really do that all that much with each other. Organizers do it, of course, but for the most part, we're not encouraged to talk to one another on that level. And so I'm very grateful that I get the ability to do that every single week. But the one thing that I guess I would just say about like the burden of it, right, is the great Jules Taylor, who produces Working People, and thank God that I connected with Jules. Actually, I connected with Jules, bringing up something we talked about earlier, that big 2-part compilation episode of worker testimonies in the late spring of 2020. If you guys go back and listen to that, you'll hear a familiar voice, which is Jules. That's how I connected with him, was he was working at a hospital at that point, and he sent in testimony, and I noticed that his audio file sounded really good, and so I was like, hey, could you give me some tips on how to be a better producer? And we just kept talking, and eventually I was like, could you come produce the show? And now we're friends and comrades, and he does an amazing job with the show. But normally I'm only kind of texting with him about this, because he sees all of the stuff that gets cut out. He hears all the stuff that gets cut out of the final episodes, and he's usually the one that I'll talk to about it, apart from my close family members. And at one point he said to me, I think this was after the hardest interview that I'd ever recorded, which was with the family of Evan Seyfried, a Kroger worker in Ohio who'd worked there for 20 years and was bullied into suicide by his horrible managers during COVID-19. Talking to his family, hearing their pain and their heartbreak was just incredibly hard. But I knew going into it that I had a huge responsibility to be a good and measured discussant so that they could share Evan's story the way that they wanted to. They could honor their son the way that they wanted to, and that we didn't sort of devolve into, like a kind of trauma-induced mess that they didn't want to publish or anything like that. It was a lot to handle, and I was trying to be very focused when I was recording that, and trying to be very open with my own emotions, as I try to do with every interview. But I guess I would just stress for people is that fucking hurts. It's a lot to wear your heart on your sleeve, and you need to do it to have the kind of conversations that we have on Working People. Because again, if you are asking other workers to open up to you, you need to do the same. You need to kind of pay in kind, and not make it feel like you're just extracting their stories and not giving anything back to the conversation. And so anyway, I think it was like after that, and we cried on that recording with Evan Seyfried's family as well. Jules just texted me and said something like, man, like it can be really hard as a producer at times to listen to you sitting there kind of taking these emotional haymakers left and right. And I kind of broke down when he said that, because I was like, again, I don't ever want to put the focus on me, but like, it was nice to have someone see that, because it can be really hard to sit there and hear the trauma that so many people go through the on a day-to-day basis, whether that's deep family traumas from abusive parents or living in poverty, or whether that is just the inhumanity of the way this system crushes people and treats them like dirt and leaves them to flounder, when as human beings we should be taking care of one another. Like, we live in a very inhumane society, and I think that we get by trying to not stare that monster in the face as much as we can. But when you do stare it in the face, when you hold the hands of your fellow workers and ask yourselves to open up about it and be honest about it and talk about it with one another, it hurts a lot, and it wears on you. But I think that it's necessary, because the longer we sit on that stuff, the less that we acknowledge it as worth talking about, the more that it just eats us alive inside. And I think that there are ways that we can build really, really robust solidarity and really remind ourselves of how precious every human life is, and how much we need to fight for one another, to honor that humanity and to honor the beauty of every human life. Once you kind of see that in your fellow workers, you can't unsee it. And so I think it's really an honor that I get to do that work. It's so great that people listen and respond, and then others, and that I'm in community with others like yourselves here at the Valley Labor Report, who are also doing this work, because I think we all need to be doing it. Anyway, I hope that wasn't too rambly, but yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, no, I think, and I think that it's important for folks to understand that. You talk to a lot of people, and there's a lot of especially that Evan Seyfried story. That for folks that haven't seen that coverage, you should go check that out on The Real News and on and on Working People. It's a really powerful story, and it's a really sad story, and I can imagine that it's both an honor and very hard to be kind of designated steward of that information and advocate. So for sure. Adam, you said.
Yeah. Well, I just got to say those last comments really resonated with me. I was, I was thinking back to my time as both a teacher and getting the stories from my students and the trauma that they would share with me, often, unprompted, unexpected, usually not at the most opportune times. And thinking about my time as an advocate representing employees, and that was one of the hardest parts, was just taking all of that in, because no one calls your union rep with good news, right? So that was what you just spoke on. Really, that hit deep for me, because I'm thinking back to conversations I had that kept me up at night. And so yeah, I think I was going to ask you kind of like what was one of the hardest parts about this, but I think you've laid that out there. It's a tremendous responsibility. But one thing that I want to say, I'm gonna borrow from your words. Actually, you write, even before we get into chapter 1, I had a lot I was underlining. One of the things you wrote about was that no book, no podcast, no one project, and no one person can ever fulfill the burningly necessary task of sharing and listening to the stories of our fellow workers, and doing so in a way that dignifies their lives and honors their humanity. It should remind us that there is an entire universe of human experience beyond the cages of our own heads. I love that quote, and I think if anyone is out here coming close to fulfilling that, you're one of the folks doing it. I really mean that. And so I don't necessarily have questions per se. I just had some comments to make, and that's one of the main things I wanted to get across was how much respect I have for the work that you do. Anytime I listen to you, it kind of not only inspires me to be better at this, but just to take stock of the responsibility that we all have as people who are trying to build a working class movement. And certainly responsibility we have in trying to do media with that project in mind. But the other thing I wanted to mention would be, this was Howard Zinn's 100th birthday this week. And there were a couple of things that you wrote there at the beginning that also resonated with me as a former history teacher. You wrote, quote, "History does not happen in broad strokes, nor is it made by a few powerful people. The stories we tell about the past just make it seem that way." And you also wrote, "History is messy because it is human, and humanity is messy. The practice of history," I'm not just talking about the past as such, I'm talking about the stories we tell, the records we keep, the memories we carry with us that serve as the collective lineage of our species. When we lose the beautiful human messiness of history, it becomes something else entirely, something that is not really ours, a half-true story we're told to tell about a dead past where the significant parts have already been colored in for us. That really spoke to me as a former history teacher, and I think it was good for me to read that. And I was reminded of Zinn and his legacy, with it being his 100th birthday this week, or would have been his 100th birthday. And I think what you've done is add to the historical record for us by documenting these worker stories. Of course, I was partial to Rebecca, her story, being Red for Ed organizer out in Arizona, formerly with Chicago Teachers Union. She was the only one that I was familiar with before the book. But, that gave me some more insight to hear from someone who's been doing the kind of thing I was doing, but obviously in a much better way, and got to learn there. So for folks who haven't checked out the book, I highly recommend it. I was trying to describe it to my wife. I said, think about the Humans of New York Facebook page that you always get sucked into when you scroll by. Imagine if that was run by like some union folks. That's the sort of thing I was trying to get across, that this is getting a real testimony from people about their lives, but about their lives as workers and as members of a working class, and in a time period of this pandemic. So, yeah, just got nothing but compliments and respect.
Thank you, brother. I really, really appreciate that. And it really means the world to me. You guys know how much I love you both and value the work that you do on and off the podcast. So it genuinely means a lot to hear that. Again, especially working so long on a book that felt like it would never finally get published, and God knows how many people will actually read it. So it's just very nice after such a long slog to have people like yourselves take it so seriously and see what I was really trying to do with it. And I think the thing that I would just really emphasize in what you said, right, and it hooks back into what I was saying before, right, about how I'm very honored to get to do this work. And in fact, I'm one of the ways that I'm able to keep going is recognizing that I am in community with so many people who are doing this work, even if it never makes it onto a podcast feed or a YouTube channel or so on and so forth. In fact, this is what labor organizers do every day. Like you were just saying, like in many ways, I learn from the people doing the real work of connecting with the folks that they are entrusted to represent in their unions, or even if they're not unionized, people who are trying to organize their fellow workers to achieve better ends for all of them. This is what organizing really is in so many ways. It is talking to people. It is listening to people. It is actually hearing them and giving them the space to open up about what they are going through and to understand them as whole human beings, not just, people who exist when they clock in and stop existing when they clock out. Right. And so you see that, I think, in the book. Right. You mentioned Rebecca Gorelli, who kicks ass. I mean, Rebecca is an incredible human being, a longtime educator, first in Chicago, and now she's working with Educators United National. She was involved with the Red for Ed movement, but this is what she does every day, right? She talks to workers. She helps them build strategies for organizing as well. That was a really important interview for me because I wanted to interview someone who was working as an organizer during COVID, right? I also wanted to interview an educator. So with Rebecca, I was able to kind of get a 2-for-1. Yeah. But I thought it was important to talk to someone on that side of things. And I also ended up talking to Willie Solis, right? Willie is a gig worker in Texas, Latino who grew up conservative like myself. So we connected on that level. And Willie will tell you, he'll be the first to tell you that he's actually a naturally introverted person, which is why his story is so incredible, because as a gig worker for Shipt, the app that Target Corporation owns, he realized that the changes to the algorithm, the black boxed algorithm that workers have no control over, he realized that his take-home pay dropped precipitously after this change, even though Shipt was saying, oh no, you're actually going to get more money, it's going to be better for you. And he was like, well, that seems like bullshit. I'm going to start asking other workers if they're going through the same thing. And he says it in the interview, he spoke to an insane amount of people in a short amount of time.
It was like
hundreds
600
of people.
Yeah.
Talked to 600 people by connecting with them over Facebook and through worker groups and stuff like that. Again, as someone who's an introvert who that kind of work is hard for, but he says in this interview in the book, he's like, I just was blown away by how much people were sharing with me. I was blown away, by what they were going through and how much it connected with what I was going through. That is someone doing the work of respecting and honoring his fellow workers. And out of those conversations has grown a movement to organize gig workers who legally right now can't be in a union, but who are banding together and acting as a union to fight for better conditions for themselves. So anyway, it's just really underlines what you, Adam, do, Jacob, what you do in your unions. So much of that, I guess the folks who watch and listen to us don't see. And in fact, the people who are doing this day in, day out to better represent their fellow workers, to fight harder for their union membership, that's really where I take my inspiration from.
Yeah, I definitely hope. I can't recommend it enough. The book is The Work of Living. You can find it online. OR Books is the publisher, and we've had at least one person go out and buy it from the podcast. We had Jose, a Teamster from Anaheim, say that he was.
Hey, Jose, thank you, brother.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.